Great. So thank you everybody for coming to another Cashmere Goat Association webinar. Today we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. John Wade of um, Microchip ID Systems. I apologize for that. So Dr. Wade received his bachelor's degree in animal science in 1975 and a doctorate of veterinary medicine from Louisiana State University in 1980. In 1989, he founded Microchip ID Systems, Inc., where he currently serves as CEO. After spending 12 years in private practice, in 92, John gave up his practice to devote full-time to the Microchip company. In 2015, Microchip ID Systems developed a mini chip for use in small and large animals, allowing chips to be implanted with a 15-gauge needle rather than a 12-gauge. Microchip ID products have been tested and approved by governmental agencies in the US as well as abroad, including the USDA 840 chip, which we'll spend a great deal of time talking about today. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody to Dr. John Wade.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys having me. I would probably just start out by saying, we're talking about the government. So anything I say,
so if they were bad, so then the the alpha can rip out their guts, so they die.
Uh-oh.
Boy, I'm telling you, I'm really getting an idea.
Am I back on or?
Yep, you're back. Sorry about that.
Oh,
Everybody,
okay.
as you join, please mute your mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just saying that, we're going to be talking about the government here. And so anything that I say cannot be held against me. I don't know if you guys remember years ago, the USDA set out to do the NAIS, National Animal Identification System. And I'm telling you, it just created such havoc among the various livestock markets out there because it was really, really going to be onerous. There were going to be requirements for everybody to have a premise ID, and at the premise you had to have an AIN manager, and everything was going to have to be microchip, and your AIN manager was going to have to scan every animal that came in, every animal that left, report to the USDA twice a week, turn in all of your data, and it just obviously it got so onerous that there became some pretty significant objections throughout the various states, some more so than others, but at any rate, that whole thing ended up getting killed completely. And they did, it had been funded, Congress had funded it for, close to $50 million, and they ended up just defunding the whole thing, and it went away. At least nationally and visibly, it went away. The USDA kind of stayed on it, and they came back with a bit of a washed out version, and on they really just toned down a lot of things that were going to be federal requirements, and they've now pretty much turned into that was sort of the origin of what we have today. And as you will see, it is the way it's turned out. It's actually, in a nutshell, the federal government has got some very basic guidelines, and within those guidelines, they do give a lot of choice, and a lot of choice goes to the state. And so pretty much what you're dealing with when you're dealing with federal regulations, it's going to be whenever an animal enters into interstate commerce, then you've got to follow the federal guidelines. And when you look at those guidelines, you will see that you've got a lot of choices on identification. And as you look at those choices, because they have given a lot of leeway to the states and the tribes, you end up in a situation where you have, if you're going to be an interstate commerce, you're going to have to look at the requirements for the federal government and meet those requirements, which as far as ID is concerned, you have choices. So you're not bound to one particular means of ID. And then additionally, you've got to look at your state, and you've got to look at the state where the animal is going. And that is largely, you're talking about an interstate health certificate, ICVI, and that is pretty much going to fall upon your veterinarian to make that call. They're going to contact the state where you're going, find out what you need, find out what identification methods are acceptable there. And then, of course, you're going to have to comply with your own state as well. And so sometimes, most of the time, that's easy to do. Sometimes it ends up being a little bit of a puzzle, but it's all doable. So when you look at the federal guidelines, it was not until a couple of years ago that they did start allowing microchips, implantable microchips, to and they recognize the implantable microchips as a formal means of identification. And so with that, you now start looking at, well, what do I have to do if I want to use an implantable device as my formal means of ID? And that is, is a microchip alone good enough? And that answer is no. You have got to, if you're going to choose to use the microchip as your formal means of ID, then you are going to have to do a tattoo as well, but it is a very small tattoo. But you're going to, I'm going to just refer to goats, but this is sheep and goats is the category for USDA or for APHIS. And of course, it all centers around scrapie. And so when you are going to use the microchip as your formal means of ID, you have two choices of where to put the chip. You can put it at the base of the ear, and the second choice is in the caudal tail fold. And if you choose to use the microchip as your only means of ID, then you're going to have to put a tattoo in the ear, or in an earless animal, it can be in the tail fold. And that is either going to be an E or an ET. And if you are placing the microchip at the base of the ear, then you need to tattoo an E in the ear, and that E has got to be 3/10 of an inch high. If you choose to put the microchip in the tail fold, then you're going to tattoo an ET in the ear to indicate that it's the tail fold. And in an earless animal, you're going to put in, if you're putting it in the tail fold and you either put the ET in the ear, or in the case of an earless animal, you would put it in the tail fold, the tattoo. And that is just to indicate that this animal is electronically identified, and the E represents at the base of the ear, and the ET represents the tail fold. And in all cases, when you do choose to use an implantable device, you are then also required to have a scanner. So you've got to be able to, in the case of an inspection, you have got to be sure to be able to provide a scanner so that the inspector can read the chip. Not all inspectors are going to have scanners. So let's see. I didn't make an error. I got an update the other day when I was talking to Christine. The one instance where you can't use electron, or there are actually several exceptions that they're too numerous to go into, but I would tell you that in certain instances, they make exceptions to your ID, but what you need to do is if you're going to go across state lines, check both states, have your scanner, and you should be in good shape if the state allows it. I will give you an example. The other day, we had somebody going to New Mexico, and you check New Mexico, and they do not allow electronic ID in the state of New Mexico because they don't want their inspectors having to run around and chase sheep or goats and try to have to scan them. So again, you're gonna run into certain exceptions out there. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
Yes, we have a question that came in asking you to clarify the tattoo requirements. It says the tattoo requirement is a new APHIS standard. An older goat may not be tattooed, as per Dr. Charles Geiser at APHIS.
When you say it may not be tattooed, you mean to indicate that animal is microchipped? Because the new rules as of 2 years ago say that they have to, and I will say, and with no exceptions. And I will say, I checked in with Dr. Brault at USDA to confirm that that was the case, and she assured me that was the case. So I would check that. I mean, if there is a USDA vet saying that, I would respect that thought and look further, because it, Dr. Brault kind of, she kind of runs the show there. And so I would say that presents an issue to look further into. But really, it's not, did you have another question?
Oh, we have lots, but so anytime
Okay.
you're ready for questions, let me know. Otherwise,
I'm ready. I really would, those are really the basics on electronic ID. And I know that there's a lot more that may arise, and maybe we should go in the direction of what is of interest to your viewers there. So why don't we do some questions here? And I can tell you a little bit more about like how to get your flock ID, how to get your premise ID. These are the things you need if you're going to use electronic ID. And I think I've given you some links to post and phone numbers to call in order to get those. But, why don't we do questions first?
sure. So actually, that was one of the questions that did come up. It was how to get a premise ID and a flock ID.
Yeah, the premise ID, here's what I would recommend that you do. And are you going to post those that I've given you? Okay. So I've given you a link and a phone number. The phone number is well, first of all, a premise ID is actually a federal number, but it is issued by the state. And so I've given you a link to go that has a list of all of the state animal health departments and their phone numbers. And it's good to have that link because those things change and they do keep up with that pretty good. And so that will get you to where you need to be issued a premise ID. And the premise ID, in order to use microchips in goats, you have to have both. You're going to have a premise ID, and you're going to have a scraping number or flock ID, and that's those two are the same thing. They're just called differently. But what you would like to do is try to get your state to issue you a premise ID first, because ultimately you're going to have them link your premise ID with your flock ID. And in order for that to happen, the APHIS is going to do that, or USDA is going to do that. And so it's best to get your premise ID first, then call to get your flock ID. You're going to call the feds to get your flock ID. And if you've got your premise, when you call them, you can give them that premise number and they will issue your flock ID. And then you just say to them, will you link those, please? And the reason for that is the reason on our end, and when you order your 840 chips, the reason that you do that is because our system is going to search for your premise, and it's going to search for your flock, and it's going to search for the link between the two. And if those things don't mesh, then we are not going to be able to issue you 840 chips. Does that make sense? Do people need clarification on that? Or when you call for you're going to put the link for the premise ID, and then you're going to put a phone number for the flock ID, and that is the federal. And when you call that number, they're going to ask you for your area code or where you're calling from. And then that system that robot is going to figure out who the representative is in your region, and it's going to give you the number to call for your region. And that too changes, and the contact person changes and whatnot. And so that is, that's why they do it that way, because it is constantly changing, and it's going to get from you where you are and get you to the right entity. And so get your state animal health department, call them first, get your premise ID, then call the feds and tell them where you are, and get with that contact person, give them your newly issued premise ID, and tell them you want a flock ID and you would like them to link those two. And once you do that, they usually are pretty good. I mean, they can do this on a single phone call. They don't always do it. Sometimes they're busy. There is an occasion where they will, you leave a message and they'll call you back. Most of the time they're pretty good about it though. And, I'm sure I'll eat my words on that, but the states I find are really good. I mean, it's, within 5 minutes, they issue a number for you on your premise. And so at any rate,
That was exactly my experience. It was super fast.
Yeah, and I would say that if anybody has trouble, our people here work with them regularly, and you do feel free to call us if you're having trouble or if you just want to vent. And just give us a buzz, and we can maybe help you. I can tell you that they are not going to let us get your premise or your flock ID, either one. They want to hear it from you. But when you do your flock ID, you really don't need much information. You need just I don't think they take post office boxes. You're going to have to give them your physical address, and the same with premise. On the premise, that is basically they're going to ID you where you are located, premise, and but so you don't really. I think phone number and email are optional on your flock ID. So, but you do need just your personal contact information when you call them. There's not a heavy duty form or requirements or anything like that you need to go through.
So I do have a question in the chat around some clarification there. So they said that they only have one number from the state of California and no second flock ID. Just wanted to clarify that premise and flock ID are both required.
They are. I'm not aware of California having anything different. When we, just so you understand it, 840s, what 840s are is that we take our regular good old normal microchip, and it was not an easy task to get approved for 840s, but basically we take our microchip and we had to send in 10 microchips and scanners, and they go through all of their testing, and they ask us a zillion questions on our manufacturing process and be sure it's an ISO procedure, and on and on and on. So finally, ultimately, you get approved or not, but assuming you get approved, then what they do is it's our normal microchip, but they issue microchip. We can order no more than so many thousand at a time, but they'll issue a set of numbers to us. These are the 840 chips that we're issuing you. So they know that those particular numbers come to us. And then when we provide chips to breeders or to farmers or whoever, then we have to report those microchip numbers. Those specific numbers have to go into the AIN, the Animal Identification System, with APHIS, so that they've got the premise and they know where those chips went. And when we do that with other animals that don't require flock IDs, all those people need, like horses or deer or some other animal is using an 840, all they need is a premise. When sheep and goats use them, they need the premise and the flock ID. And when we report those, we have to put both numbers in, and they have to tie, and thus the link that we were talking about. But if they don't tie, and when we enter the portal to put those numbers in, then it will not let us enter it will not let us do the transaction. And so for that reason, I can tell you, I would be shocked if there's something unique about California with regard to the flock and the premise.
Sure. So Laurel is still asking for additional clarification. Laurel, would you like to come off mute and seek additional clarification?
Hi there. Yeah. I've had a premise ID for about 5 years and no flock ID, and they issued me ear tag numbers, like the consecutive number. They sent me ear tags with just my premise ID. That's all I have. So this is new information to me. And is it just for microchipping?
I don't think so. I would say that it is probably, I'm not sure of that, you know, there could be something different, I suppose, if you're, did you get those directly from APHIS or US?
Yes, I did.
You know, perhaps there's something there that's different if you're getting directly from them. I'm really not certain. That's the first I've heard of that, and I'm not sure.
All righty.
I can tell you on the chips, and it may be because they're chips, or it may be because you got them directly from them. But I would, that surprises me because I don't, it's kind of contrary to their whole system, and that is to, you know, get you entered into the, if there were a scrapey event, I don't see how they're doing that without tying it to a flock ID. But
I
you know,
see.
if you do want to pursue that, you know, I'll be glad to jump in there and give them a call or try to help you with that if you're.
I can call them. I just had not heard this before.
Yeah.
May I step in? I've been doing ear tags for 20 years. And when I began, it was just the state number, the New York state assigned number. And when I went to microchips, I do believe I had to get another number. And as I understand the history of this, the Scrapey ID system that involved the original plastic tags that were administered free, and I've been doing this since 2004, was an earlier system. And then they went to a national system that involved a second number. And maybe that's what has happened for Laurel. She has an ear tag, but has never gotten that premises ID for microchipping. That's just my guess. But because there was a parallel, there was an earlier movement, had something to do with the history of scrapey identification for sheep and goats, which was way ahead of mad cow disease and all the things that made them, not just in the United States, need a national system, but needed our international partners needed to be able to know that we could trace our meat stock back to the flock or herd of origin. And so this whole thing has evolved, but the sheep and goat industry was a step ahead of everybody else because they were already concerned about scrapey alone, not to mention all these other things that we're trying. It's important that our food supply be traceable. And that's why all this has evolved the way it is. But I started out with a ear tag established, issued by the New York State, but later got a number that was usable on my microchips.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say one more thing, because the microchip product page that has the link here, I went to it and it says premise ID and or flock ID.
Uh-oh. That's, you know, for 840s.
Yeah, for 840s.
Yeah, for 840s, there are a lot of other species that use them. And those species are not subject to scrapey. And so that perhaps could be better worded, just to clarify, you know, not everybody needs a flock ID. And so if you're doing white-tailed deer in Texas, they require 840s, but they don't have a scrapey issue. So all they need is a premise ID. But if it's a sheep or a goat, it's got to be both. And I appreciate that, pointing that out, because it is a little confusing.
Thank you.
Lots more questions coming in for Dr. Wade, but I'm going to ask actually Pam to answer this next question as it relates directly to the Cashmere Goat Association registry. Pam, could you talk a little bit about the CGA registry requirements and how a microchip may be used for registration?
Sure. We do already use microchips as one of the identifying tools for identifying the goats. So I don't see any issues here. it's just one of 3 ways that we allow goats to be identified uniquely. And in fact, it is not the driving factor behind the unique identification of the goat. The herd code and the name of the goat is actually what we use to ensure that we have a unique identifier for each goat. But I don't see any issues here with anybody using microchips, ear tags or tattoos. Yeah.
You know,
Thanks.
there's certain instances out there that in which you can use microchips as your formal means of ID, but in certain, like in traveling or in various things, it's just too detailed and to go into. But in certain instances, you will have to have a registration, a breed association registration of that animal with that microchip number on the registry form as proof that this animal with this microchip number matches this paper. And so you've got to, in certain instances, have a breed registry or registration form on that animal with the chip number.
Okay. I believe our registration forms do put the microchip number or whatever the identifying number is submitted by the owner on them, but I can double check and make very sure it's there.
I can answer that. Actually, it does, because we use
does.
it
Thank you.
for our 4-H shows. We use our microchip number and the Cashmere goat registry to get our goats into shows.
Okay.
So you did put it on there. Thank you for doing that.
No problem. We're efficient.
Lots more questions coming in. Can you talk about how to insert a microchip? Best practices for that.
Yeah, you know, there are several videos out there available, and it's a pretty simple procedure. And like many things, the first time you're doing it is no fun. You're going to be nervous about it just because you've never done it. But I think once you do it, and ideally it would be nice to have somebody to do one, have your vet do it for you the first time or two, and get a feel for what it is. But once you do a couple of them, it's really not bad. You'll see that it's, it gets to be old hat pretty quick. But and I tell you that to encourage you to barrel through that first one. Okay, just go ahead and get through the first couple, and then you'll be okay. But essentially what it is, where the cartilage of the ear meets the head, you're going to go to that spot, to the base of the ear, and you're going to go to the back of the ear, or actually I go a little bit to the top, and you're going to just do your skin prep, alcohol, Novosan, betadine, whatever. I do know some people that don't use anything, but I would recommend using one of those disinfectants, and then you're just going to make a little tent there, right where the cartilage meets the bone, and you can make a little tent, pop your needle under there. I would like to see everybody get the whole needle under the skin, just simply because you want that to be kind of sitting cradled right in that little crevice or fold where the cartilage meets the bone, in that little bend. And if you go too shallow, if any of that microchip ends up in the skin itself, the body will get rid of it. And so that's why you'd like to get that needle all the way under, and then just drop the tip of your needle down into that little fold. And that way you know that your you're in there, and that as you push your plunger, you're not going to be depositing that chip in the skin itself. And if you get that whole needle under the skin, you know that you're not doing that. So little disinfectant, make a little tent, pop your needle under the skin, and just take it all the way to the hub of the needle, drop it down in the little fold there where the cartilage meets the bone, push your plunger, and then just put a little pressure on where that chip is, and you'll know where that is. It's going to be right at the end of that needle. A little pressure on there. And what I like to do is just give just a little twirl on that syringe when I pull it out, just to make certain that the chip, any contact between the chip and the tip of that needle is broken. And so with a little digital pressure right there on the chip, a little twirl as you're coming out, that chip's going to stay in place, and it's not going to try to track back out and follow that needle. And that way, you know that it's not going to end up in the skin. And that's the biggest fear, is that the thing would back out and then it's lost and gone forever. On the tail fold, it's essentially, you're going to do the same thing. Does everybody know where the tail fold is? We don't have any pictures here, but it's pretty straightforward right there. I always, in microchips, in any species and anything, I always do, and it's standard, to go on the left side. If you're going to do a bird, you do it in the left breast muscle. If you're doing it in a horse, you go on the left nuchal ligament. And so just routinely, I always do everything on the left side. There is no requirement for that by USDA. So you really can go on either side, but at any rate, I get comfortable doing it on the left side. So you just go back to the caudal tail fold, and again, I would encourage you to go. YouTube's got a ton of videos, and it's a lot easier to visualize it as you're looking at it rather than hear me talk about it. But do your skin prep. You'll see the little fold on each side of the tail, and so you'll lift the tail up. Do your skin prep. Lift the tail up. I will go from the bottom up, from down to up, and get under the skin. Take the put the whole needle under. Take it again to the hub. You're in the subcutaneous tissue. Put the entire needle under the skin, push the plunger, and then as the tail comes down, basically gravity is going to be on your side for that thing not to back out. I feel like a picture's worth 1,000 words. Go to YouTube.
Sister, did you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to go back to the earlier question about goats sold with chips before 2 years ago. In other words, 2 years ago, when they finalized the rule about microchipping, I know for a fact there are goats out there that have not had tattoos put in their ears. They're grandfathered back before even the CGA registry. There was an earlier registry, and some of those goats are registered there. In fact, there are still goats in the system that use the old microchip before the new numbers were created. I'm a show superintendent, so I follow this stuff. And I know that I have seen goats who have passed ownership 3 or 4 times and settled on the farm who said, "What do I do? They don't have an ear tag." They also did not have an ear tattoo. They probably had microchip because I know the farm of origin. So a couple of questions here. First, they exist without tattoos. So they're in the system without any identification that they have microchips. At some point, they were transferred in ownership without a transfer of the registry, which as I understand the rules, is not supposed to happen. So we need to be educated about the requirements if you're using microchips as a form of microchip
A form of
identification.
ID, yeah. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that, but I would certainly get with you, and I will get with USDA and get that answered. I will say this, the tattoo requirement came later when they initially approved microchips as the formal accepted means of ID in sheep and goats. That was not a requirement. And then, of course, when they did that, when they approved microchips, they also, you had a time limit. Anything that was 2000 prior to 2017 could be the different format chip. And then it ultimately became, it's got to be the 840. And there were some different, it just changes along the way. And one of the later changes was the tattoo requirement. And so it doesn't surprise me that that happened a while back. It is my understanding, and I'll be glad to work with you and get clarification from USDA on if there's any, with the different formatted microchips, there are exceptions. If it was before 2017, it could be this. And if it was after 2017 to 19, it could be this. And then it became, and now it's got to be this. And so there clearly changes along the way. I am not aware, again, I called Dr. Broth to ask her the very question, if they have to have the tattoo. She told me yes, but I can give her a buzz back and expand on that a little bit. Be glad to.
Well, my point is there are goats in the system who are owned by owners who know nothing of any of this,
Right.
who don't have ear tattoos. Do they have to now be ear tattooed? So what I would have said to the goat owner who was given rescue goats, essentially, that she knew they were fine, wonderful, well-bred cashmere goats, they were worth having. She had a sense of where they came from originally. I took microchipping devices, readers out, and the one that probably would have worked on these goats wasn't charged, so I couldn't confirm for her. But my read on the situation is, if you own a goat that doesn't have visible ID, it's your responsibility to either register them with a microchip or to put an ear tag in. Because when they leave your premise, they should leave with some kind of visible ID on it. But the reason why this is important is because it's a food supply that we're affecting, and the inability to trace these animals is a problem.
Well, I think that's what ultimately led them to require the tattoo, so that you at least have a visible means of identifying, okay, this animal is identified electronically. And then theoretically, if you're in that position, you're supposed to have a scanner with you.
So then the other question that I would have is from the rule in the Scrapie standard. It says, for registered animal, it must have the implant number has been recorded in the book record of a sheep or goat registry association and on the registry. We've asked that. That when the animal is sold, they're accompanied by a copy of the registration, and if not in the name of the new owner, a copy of a completed application for the transfer of ownership in the name of the current owner, where the sale occurred within 60 years. In other words, there's a 60-day limit by which that change has to be made in our database,
right,
to the new owner. And that needs to be understood as people use microchips in the sale of animals. And the last thing that I would point out is that you have to be careful. So every show has its own rules regarding invisible tagging. And I was told in the state of Vermont that 4-H shows require a Scrapie tag. period. And we show in Vermont, we were told that we could run the show as we wish, but why would we ever accept this? Well, we've been doing it for generations in terms of goats, so we accept it. But we have to realize in some places, the lack of visible ID is a problem and is considered to be a problem. As convenient and as useful as many of us feel microchips to be. So you have to check your state, you have to check your shows. They all have their own rules.
Exactly. And I can't emphasize that enough. It is critical that you know the state you're going to. I mean, you definitely don't want to trek across the country and then learn that you weren't supposed to. And yeah, you need to check. And it's easy. I mean, your vet's going to get you set really. And you know, if you're going to cross state lines, you're going to have a health certificate. And you know, having done health certificates, I can assure you that the vet is going to have to contact the state and say, give me all the requirements for entering your state, and he should know.
For example, I had my vet out for CBI check of my herd this week. And at one point she turned to me and said, of course, you know, in New York State, microchipping is not allowed. And I could only look at her and say, I got all the ID to do it in New York State. It is allowed in New York. Most states won't buck the federal system. Some states, as you pointed out, like New Mexico, will.
Right.
But the same thing I found in Vermont when I talked to the state vet and said, here is your website. Here is what is said is allowed. You don't mention microchips. And they said, why would you microchip? And I said, we've been doing it forever. And she said, well, we accept everything that the national government has in place. If we accept them, we just never thought anybody would use this particular thing. So there you have it. But then I was told privately by the 4-H veterinarian that they would not accept microchipped in a 4-H show in the state of Vermont. So you just have to be careful where you're going.
Right. You know, it's all over the map, and it works so many ways. I mean, 840 chips are just kind of are out there. And I had a vet in California require a person to have an 840 chip in a potbelly pig that was coming in to the state. And I called him and said, you know, I mean, microchips are not a formally approved means of ID for pigs. And so I called to let them know that, and they would hear nothing of it. They want an 840 chip. Thank you very much. Okay. If that's what it's going to take to get the pig. Anyway, my point is, you know, there are organizations, there are state governments, there are tribals, there are a number of entities that have their own view, good, bad, or otherwise. And if you're dealing with those entities, it is going to be best to check with them and make sure that you're covered.
So we only have about 9 minutes left. We're getting lots of questions around food chain and potential for chips to migrate. So those are kind of in the similar vein. Could you speak about can chips migrate, what you can do to mitigate that if that's an issue? And then what are your thoughts and the government's thoughts about microchipping in meat animals?
Yeah, in fact, this is what I was going to say earlier. I spoke to both of you and Christine on the phone the other day, and I have an update for that. So I gave you outdated information that is now changed. It used to be that if you were going to take a goat if you were en route to slaughter, that you could use a microchip, and when you got there, you had to notify the slaughter facility that this animal is chipped and locate the chip for them, tell them where it is, and that was fine. Now the rule is, if it's going to slaughter, it's got to have a visible ear tag. That's the rule. End of story. One sentence. To a federal facility.
Can they have the microchip still?
They can.
Okay.
But they are required to have a visible an ear tag.
Great. And then what about chips
Migrating.
migrating?
You know, you don't often see it, but you do, and it's you know, first of all, if you scan an animal and can't find a chip, then just start looking elsewhere, because as long as you got it put in there properly, it's still going to be in the animal. As long as it didn't back out, that's a bigger concern than anything. And I would just tell you, just from our ongoing QC and checking, the failure rate of microchips is 0.02%. And so, you know, it's all mechanical, it's put together mechanically. There are no moving parts. I mean, those things it's just hard for them to fail. Many years ago, we did see that when we put them in differently, there was a time that people they would load their own chips in the needle. And in those instances, you could certainly see where in the loading process, if you got your needle a little cockeyed and you ended up putting that chip in a bind, that you could crack the glass of the chip, and you put the chip in, and then it reads just fine. And then over a period of time, body fluid would seep into through that crack, and then ultimately short that chip out. But with these chips now that are preloaded and everything's just ready to go, you just don't see that failure in that instance. But the thing to prevent that you can do, you know, of course, when we make the microchip, we coat it with a parylene C, and it is a product that it does two things. It seals the glass, but it also promotes connective tissue formation. And so that coating actually helps get the connective tissue to anchor that chip in place. It promotes that growth, so it happens a lot more quickly than it would ordinarily happen with just a slick piece of glass. But what you'd like to do, I think the biggest thing on your technique or the microchipping procedure is get the microchip as deep as you can. In other words, as I described a while ago, what you'd like to do is when you make your tent and you pop the needle under the skin, you want to get it in that fold. You don't want to just make a tent and then just kind of chip it anywhere. If you do that, you know, you're going to be in, if you just, you know, like a vaccine, like a sub-Q vaccine, or, you know, really anywhere is good. It's just fine. The sub-Q tissue, there are two layers to it. There's the sub-Q, and then as you get down and you approach the fascia or the muscle, as you get down deeper into the sub-Q, that sub-Q tissue becomes more dense. And so it makes a difference. But when you make your tent and you pop your needle under, just drop your tip down. Be sure that you're in that fold, which means you're at the deeper part of the sub-Q tissue, and it is just more dense. The upper part is more loosely configured, and it's just a little harder for that thing to get the connective tissue to start scarring it in and anchoring that thing. And so if you when you make your tent, pop your needle under, drop the tip down, and be sure you're in that little fold, and push your plunger, hold it in place, and pull out. And so that's probably the biggest thing to prevent migration, is just don't get it too shallow.
And then to, just for everyone to hear, based on our conversation the other day, what age do you recommend microchipping?
You know, I can tell you that, I mean, I know people that do it at day olds. I've got different species that do it, you know, horses, they'll do it at 1 day old, and pluck the hairs for DNA, put the chip number in the DNA kit, and just pack it off, and it's done. I've got dog people that do it at day 1. And so you can certainly do it earlier, and you're probably going to be just fine. But you get good tissue development at 5 weeks. Can you go earlier than that? Sure. And I know it's convenient to go earlier in many cases, but 5 weeks is a pretty solid period of age at which you've got the adequate tissue development that you're going to be able to get that connective tissue to form and hold that chip in place. And many years ago, people, I know they don't now, particularly with the federal requirements, but when people first started doing goats, before it was actually approved and so forth, a lot of people went where they do in dogs, and that's right between the shoulder blades. Migration was just horrible. And I mean, a lot of migration occurred when you went between the shoulder blades, and you just don't see it nearly in the tail fold or at the base of the ear like you did there. Not really an issue anymore, but what else?
I think that we touched on the majority of the big themed questions that we had. List. Do you want to talk a little bit about if people were to decide to try chips, about your readers?
Oh yeah, I mean, we've got that's really a pretty cool thing, particularly with the requirements out there. I mean, years ago, I mean, you were going to just get ready when you had to get a scanner because they were expensive, and at least now they've come down to where it's something that's manageable. And so these little scanners, you can get starter kits if you're going to get chips and a scanner, and I mean, you can get the price down pretty good on those things. So I think the normal price on those, I think, is about $60, something like that. And so, given that in instances where you're going to use formal ID, they require you to have one, it's pretty good. So, and there are other scanners too. And, this is the one that seems to be the most practical for the uses that you guys would need. I will say we do have another one that if somebody's got a lot of animals and they want to, if your records are electronic, we've got one that's got Bluetooth that is really pretty cool, because you can, wherever you place your cursor on your device and you scan that animal, it's going to pop that chip right in there for you. And it just prevents a lot of, those are long numbers, obviously. It's easy to make a typo, and so it's pretty convenient for you just to, and they're backlit and they're really nice, but those things are a little over $200, so it's not always that practical unless you really have a need for it. But yeah, that's out there.
Great. So we have reached the end of our hour with you. I have provided in the comments links to all of the websites that you recommended for additional information from the
Oh,
USDA
good.
for flock ID scrapies, as well as links to your 840 chip page.
Well, I appreciate you putting that there. I really didn't mean this to be an advertisement, but more educational, but I appreciate that. I really do.
No, we appreciate it too. We're not getting any kickbacks or anything from
No.
but
Hey,
we,
and listen,
we're grateful for you coming on to speak with us and
well,
teach us more about chipping.
you bet. And listen, for anybody who feels like they would like to go a little further, please feel free to call me, and I'll be glad to get with you and be the liaison there, or I can contact USDA, and I'll be glad to help clarify anything. If you just want to call the office and ask for me, they'll chase me down and we'll get busy and get these questions answered.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you everybody for joining. Have a
Thanks
good night,
now.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.